Hello, I'm Leon Average, president of Home Classroom Video. The series of lessons on Home Classroom Video are taught to you by top teachers, top credentialed teachers in their field. These lessons will help you learn easier and faster. We recommend that you have a pen or a pencil and some paper, and that you are not interrupted while you are watching the lesson. We also would like you to watch for our address at the end of this tape so that you may write to us and find out about other video courses. Now, get ready to listen to your teacher and enjoy your new self-esteem. Thank you. You are about to watch a lesson on a review of U.S. history and United States government. The purpose of this lesson is to help students review what they might have forgotten in U.S. history and government, and also as a help to new Americans pass the U.S. Citizenship test. It is my feeling that if you listen carefully and watch carefully and have a notebook and take some notes, you will be able to successfully pass any U.S. history and basic government test. This will be the story of America. And actually, there'll be 3 lessons. The first lesson, I would like to teach you about the 13 American colonies, the beginnings of America. In the second lesson, we will take a brief look at the Revolutionary period in American history. And the third lesson, we will touch on how the American government works under the Constitution. At times that you feel comfortable, you be sure to stop your tape or press the pause button on your VCR and write some of the words that I point to on the chalkboard. And also you may stop the tape to take additional notes. On with the story of America. America had its beginnings, you might say, in the 1400s, when European explorers were looking for a faster trade route to trade with India and the East Indies. Christopher Columbus, trying to find the fastest way to the Indies, decided to travel west across the Atlantic Ocean. Follow the pointer, and you'll see Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. Columbus's destination was really the Indies, and he had no idea that North America would be in its way. And Columbus expected to sail all the way up to the East Indies here. And now if you'll watch the pointer, Columbus sailed to what we call the West Indies right here. So we give credit for Columbus for finding America. And America's name comes from a map maker, Amerigo Vespucci. Now on with the story of the 13 colonies. America is mostly going to be settled by the English. This is why, to this day, the English language is spoken in the United States. The first colony in America was in the present-day state of Virginia. Now, I caution you, viewers, as you watch the video, to concentrate on the east coast of the United States and not the remainder of the map, which shows existing states. We must recall that in 1607, at the founding of Jamestown in Virginia, there were no states. There was vast wilderness, and the Native Americans, or Indians, roamed North America. Jamestown, in present-day Virginia, was settled along the Chesapeake Bay. And it was settled by a company in England. And the company in England had sent settlers out really to make money. Investors had hoped that by sending settlers to North America, gold and silver and riches would be found. But instead, gold and riches were not found, and there were swamps and very hard times, and there was starving time. Now, most settlers came to Jamestown for adventure. They also came to Jamestown to find riches. But there were some who came to Jamestown for a new start. And these people were called indentured servants. And indentured servants got their passage paid to Jamestown with a promise of 7 years of work for the person who paid their passage to the New World. Now, there were hard times in Jamestown, and Jamestown was settled, as we said, by the London Company. But a strong leader showed up in Jamestown and began to get the colony to really work together and to flourish. And his rule was, as many of our rules are to this day, and Captain John Smith, who took charge of Jamestown, had what he called the work or starve rule. And the work or starve rule in Jamestown said that those people must work and stop looking for gold and silver. They must go out and plant corn and crops and not be afraid of the Indians. So Captain John Smith's work or starve rule was a major reason for the success of Jamestown. Now, there were 3 other reasons for the success of Jamestown in early Virginia. And one reason was the growth of tobacco. For a long time, a crop was looked for that would actually make money for the settlers in Jamestown. And remember, they were looking for riches, they were looking for gold and silver, but tobacco became the crop that could be sold. Once they began to ship tobacco back to England, money came into the colony. Families came, and one tradition in America began, the tradition of representative government. Because in Jamestown, the first House of Representatives, or House of Burgesses, as it was called, was representative government in America. Now, I'd like to move over to the chalkboard and have you write some things down that we've just covered. So let's take a look over here. Lesson 1, and we will discuss all 13 colonies. We are talking about Jamestown, Virginia. We found out that it was settled by the London Company. We found out that in Jamestown there was a strong leader, Captain John Smith, and one tradition of America that we hold so dear, representative government in America. Make sure that you write those down. The next settlement that we are going to discuss is the settlement of Plymouth. While you are viewing the chalkboard, you might as well copy these words down so that we don't have to show this again to you. So take a moment and copy Plymouth, Massachusetts, Pilgrims, the Mayflower Compact, Captain Miles Standish, and our holiday of Thanksgiving. So if you'll write all that, take a moment to do that, then we'll go back to the map and continue the story. Now, come back to the map, and we find out that Plymouth is in present-day Massachusetts. There was a religious group in England who were seeking religious freedom and who were not following the religion that the king had wished the people of England to follow. So the settlers are going to be called the Pilgrims. They are going to first settle in the Netherlands, but later, after approximately 10 years in the Netherlands, they are going to make their journey to America. The Pilgrims, they are named after the word pilgrimage, which means a a long voyage or a long journey to someplace new. And the Pilgrims settled in Plymouth, not by choice. The Pilgrims' destination was Virginia, and I'm sure you remember that we discussed there already was a colony in Virginia named Jamestown, begun by the London Company. But as they reached the East Coast, a fierce storm blew them off course, and they landed in present-day Massachusetts in the settlement of Plymouth. The name of the Pilgrim ship was the Mayflower. That perhaps could be a test question if you are taking the citizenship and naturalization test. The ship was called the Mayflower. Before the Pilgrims got off the ship and decided to remain in Plymouth, they wrote a historical document on the Mayflower, which is another step in self-government in America. They wrote the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was an agreement among those on board the Mayflower to make laws and to obey them. So this was another step in self-government in America. Well, Plymouth was a very successful colony and began to grow rapidly. And Plymouth was successful because of several reasons. One reason was an Indian, and the Indian's name was Squanto. And Squanto helped the Pilgrims plant corn. Also, an army general, or an army soldier, we might say, by the name of Captain Miles Standish, taught the Pilgrims how to fight and defend themselves against the Indians. So Plymouth grew, became very popular. More and more people came from England and settled in Plymouth. We celebrate our holiday, our American holiday of Thanksgiving, our bountiful holiday to celebrate the bountiful harvest of Plymouth a year after the Pilgrims settled there. So American tradition, again, on the Thanksgiving holiday, is from the Pilgrims in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Okay, so now we have settled Jamestown in Virginia. We have settled the community of Plymouth in present-day Massachusetts. Massachusetts, as we look here on the map again, Massachusetts began to grow very, very rapidly. And by 1640, there were 20,000 residents in Massachusetts because the colony of Massachusetts was settled by the religious group in England known as the Puritans. And that also could very well be a test answer. Now, other colonies began to form along the East Coast. As we look on this map, this area from Massachusetts and its neighbors is called the area of New England. These colonies began because of strict Puritan rule. People left Massachusetts and began to populate the surrounding colonies. For example, the colony of Rhode Island was settled by Roger Williams. And Rhode Island was the first American colony that had what is known as a separation of church and state. Roger Williams, who settled Rhode Island, believed that religion and government should be kept apart. And there were no laws governing voting rights or land ownership that had anything to do with religion. And this was certainly a big step and a big change. Also, Roger Williams set up the colony of Rhode Island, and we'll take another look so that you can see where it is on the map. Roger Williams settled a colony of Rhode Island. Again, many people came there for religious freedom. So Rhode Island began to grow. Another colony, after we leave Rhode Island, is Connecticut. Connecticut was begun by a preacher and his congregation. Thomas Hooker began the colony of Connecticut. So now we've settled Jamestown earlier, of course, in Virginia, but we've settled Plymouth in Massachusetts, we've settled Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Let's take a look at this chalkboard and make sure that you write these down in your notebooks, the students in the classroom and those of you who are watching on your VCR. Rhode Island, separation of church and state. Connecticut, Thomas Hooker. Now, the colonies that we have discussed and New Hampshire are the New England colonies. And to this day, that section of the country is known as New England. We next are going to cover the middle colonies. And as long as you're watching this chalkboard, you might write down the 3 geographical areas of the 13 colonies. New England, the middle colonies, because they're in the middle, and the southern colonies. We'll take a look now at the middle colonies, and I'll show you where they are as we go back to the map. And we will begin with the colony of New York. New York, one of our largest current-day states, but in those days, a Dutch colony. The Dutch colony of New York was originally called New Netherland, but the English were very concerned about its prime location and the excellent seaport. So the English, without firing a shot, took the New Netherland colony away from the Dutch. And since it was the Duke of York who had a lot to do with this, the colony was renamed New York. So the settlement of New York, which became a melting pot, people from all over the world came to settle in New York. The colony of New Jersey was actually begun by friends of the Duke of York, and that colony also began to prosper. Another colony of the middle colonies was Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania was begun by a religious group called the Quakers. The Quakers were led to Pennsylvania by William Penn. And actually, Pennsylvania means Penn's Woods or Penn's Forest. The king owed William Penn's father money. But after William Penn's father died, William Penn said that he would prefer taking land in North America as payment, and that also he would take those of the Quaker religion to Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania was begun by the Quakers, led by William Penn. Also built in Pennsylvania by William Penn was the city of Philadelphia, known as the city of brotherly love. Another middle colony was Delaware. Delaware was settled by people from Sweden. And Delaware was also the first American colony that had the log cabin. The log cabin that became so famous on the American West was begun in Delaware. Well, now in your lessons and in your notes, you have covered the New England colonies and the middle colonies. Now let's take a look at the southern colonies. The southern colonies, we already have discussed Virginia. Virginia, the settlement of Jamestown. Remember, representative government begun in Virginia, the Virginia House of Burgesses, or the Virginia House of Representatives. So we have already discussed Virginia. The colony of Georgia was settled by a humanitarian, a man in England, his name, James Oglethorpe. And James Oglethorpe took the debtors out of debtor prison. After settling Georgia, the debtors in Georgia made it quite a successful colony. And James Oglethorpe lives in history as taking debtors out of prison and settling Georgia. Georgia, the buffer colony between Spanish Florida and the English colonies. You must remember that Florida was not an original American colony, was not settled by the English, but remained under Spanish control. North and South Carolina then also became largely settled. The settlements between Virginia and Georgia rapidly grew with fine seaports and major cities. Let's go to the chalkboard and review some of the things that we have been talking about. Now, New York, remember the middle colony was Dutch, taken by the Duke of York. Also, we talked about New Jersey, Pennsylvania, William Penn, watch your spelling, Quakers, Delaware, the Swedish colony of Delaware. Take a look at this chalkboard and remember some of the southern colonies that we talked about. Maryland, Lord Baltimore, Catholic colony. Baltimore, a big city in Maryland to this day. Georgia, settled by James Oglethorpe, the debtors colony, and North and South Carolina. Oh, so Virginia's been left out? You've forgotten your lesson. Virginia was the first settlement, a southern colony, all towards revolution. We'll talk very briefly about British laws, Proclamation of 1763, Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Tax on Tea, and a little bit about Patrick Henry and Sam Adams. Some of these are events that would take a long time to explain. So if you'll write these down, and we will briefly just talk about them. The Americans, after the American Revolution, were busy setting up their government, busy setting up their towns and cities, but there were a series of British laws that bothered the colonists. The first one of these was called the Proclamation of 1763. This was a British law that forbade the colonies from moving west. The colonists, the Americans, wanted to move west to begin new farms and farm new land, but this proclamation would not allow it. Also, there were taxes, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, which required a stamp on certain paper. This tax money went to England. The tax on tea. Tea was a favorite drink in those days, and the tax on tea hurt the colonists deeply. Two famous Americans of those days, Patrick Henry and Sam Adams, were leaders in the revolt against England. And they kept telling the colonists it was important that they could be free and independent. In fact, Patrick Henry once, in a speech at the Virginia House of Burgesses, in a fiery speech, said, "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." He was talking about revolting against England. No taxation without representation was also the battle cry of the early Americans. They were being taxed in England, but they had no say. Now, as we come over here and look at this chalkboard, I'd like you to write these words down and then take a look at them in a library book or in a history book that you might find. The Boston Massacre. This happened in the Boston Town Square when Bostonians, mostly young people, threw snowballs at the British soldiers. The British opened fire. Several colonists were killed. Every American knows the story about the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party, of course, was not a tea party at all, but was when the Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Indians in the early 1770s, threw the valuable tea cargo into Boston Harbor. In an attempt to put down this growing rebellion, the British Army marched on Concord and Lexington in Massachusetts. It was there that the revolution began, as shots were fired between the colonists, the Americans, and the British. To this day, no one knows who fired the first shot, but it is called the shot heard round the world, because this began the American Revolution. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress was busy writing a document. The document they wrote was adopted July 4th, 1776. And this document that was adopted July 4th, 1776, was the Declaration of Independence. This document and its signing is why we celebrate the 4th of July with fireworks, and we call it the Independence Day celebration, or many people just call it the 4th of July. The person who wrote the Declaration of Independence was Thomas Jefferson. He will later be the third president of the United States. In his declaration, he wrote many stirring paragraphs, stating things against the English rule. Some of the things, however, that we remember most dearly in the Declaration of Independence was Thomas Jefferson's statement that all men are created equal and that all men are born with equal rights. The Declaration of Independence, one of the greatest documents ever written in America and perhaps in the world, written by Thomas Jefferson. During the American Revolution, there were several highlights and several people who were important. George Washington was elected by the Continental Congress as the commander-in-chief of the colonial army. And George Washington was a brilliant commander. Without him, the revolution would have been lost. Valley Forge. Americans spent a freezing winter in Valley Forge, as with very little uniforms and poor clothing and shoes, the American Army stayed together in Valley Forge. Saratoga during the American Revolution was an important battle, because it was this battle and a stunning American victory that brought the French in the war to help the Americans, and the French were instrumental in the British surrender at Yorktown. Well, now we have covered Lesson 1, the 13 American colonies. I've tried to show you some of the high points of the American Revolution, including the important Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. That will conclude Lessons 1 and 2. And in Lesson 3, we'll give you a brief Constitution or a brief civics and government lesson and show you how the American government works and laws are passed. Now we've concluded 2 lessons. Let's take a look at Lesson 3, which will be a little bit about government and the new nation created after the American Revolution. We'll go to the chalkboard and title this lesson in your notebook, Lesson 3, Government. Well, right after the American Revolution, the 13 colonies organized a government called the Articles of Confederation. And this joined the 13 colonies together as a nation. But the Articles of Confederation lacked strength. There was no real power. And each of the 13 states really continued to do as they wanted to. There was no one nation. Any representatives in Europe needed all 13 states represented to be effective. There was not really one single government. So the Founding Fathers, as we call them, the Founding Fathers, important words, because the Founding Fathers are the men who wrote the U.S. Constitution in 1787. Now, the Constitution, written in that summer of Philadelphia, in Philadelphia, was so brilliant that to this present day, there are very few changes. It is incredible that people in 1787, and we know how the way of life was different in 1787 than it is in present day, that they could foresee the future and write a plan of government that was so perfect that it has lasted through wars, economic crisis, population booms. It's incredible, really, that our government has been able to work through all types of turmoil, even through, at times, presidential resignations, if it is necessary. The preamble is the first paragraph of the Constitution and kind of states what the Constitution is all about. And the first words of the preamble is, "We the people of the United States." And that shows that the people were the ones who wrote the Constitution and actually gave it its final approval. The Constitution divides our government into three basic branches. And on this one, I would like you to write these words down: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Each branch of government is very important, but each branch of government has separate functions. For example, the legislative branch is the law-making branch. It is a legislative branch that makes laws. The executive branch is the branch that the president and his advisors are in. And sometimes we even call the president the chief executive. And sometimes, when we refer to him as the commander of the army, we call him the commander-in-chief. The judicial branch is the Supreme Court. The 9 justices of the court have the final say in any type of laws regarding the Constitution. So you are to remember the 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. Now we will take a very brief look at the legislative branch, which is Congress. Congress is composed of 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. It was necessary to have 2 houses of Congress because of the early debate among the states on how they would be represented in Congress. The large states wanted representation by population, and the small states wanted every state being equal. It was decided by compromise to have a 2-house Congress. So, in the legislative branch in Congress, we have 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, there may be some more notes you would like to take down. In the House of Representatives, there are 435 representatives. They are selected on the basis of state population. The state count is taken every 10 years, and this is called a census. In the House of Representatives, the term of office of the representatives is 2 years. In the Senate, every state is equal. There are 2 senators from each state. There are, at present, 100 senators in the Senate. Their term of office is 6 years. So their term of office is longer than the term for a representative in the House of Representatives. So Congress is made up of 2 houses. For a law to pass, you may wonder, well, how is a law passed? Can a law be brought up and voted on in one house or the other house? For a law or an idea, which we call a bill, for a bill to become a law, it must pass both houses of Congress by a majority vote and be signed by the president. Now, it could happen that the president does not like a bill or a proposed law and does not sign it into law. If he does not, that is called a veto, V-E-T-O. Then the bill goes back to the House where it began in, and for the bill to become law, it must pass by a 2/3 vote of each House. Well, for Congress, that gives you the basics of what you should know. The person in charge of the House of Representatives is called the Speaker of the House. So many times we hear this on the news, the Speaker. The person who leads the House of Representatives is called the Speaker, and the man, or woman perhaps someday, who presides over the Senate is the Vice President of the United States. The President of the United States is in the executive branch. Refer back to your notes. We had it on the other board. You should have it written down. The executive branch is headed by the President. The President sees that laws are carried out. He has advisors, and the President's advisors are known as his cabinet. The President's term of office is 4 years, and he may be reelected. The President also must be a native-born citizen and must be 35 years old. The Supreme Court is in the judicial branch. The judicial branch decides on laws or interprets laws or decides on who is right if there is a case. And the Supreme Court has the final word on whether a law is constitutional or unconstitutional. A constitutional law, in their judgment, means that a law is correct and does not violate anyone's rights. An unconstitutional law is thrown out and is not considered good and is no longer a law. Well, in your notes then, you have the three branches. You have the legislative branch, you have the executive branch, and you have the judicial branch. You should be able to know what goes under those headings, whether it's Congress or the President or the Supreme Court. Now, when the Constitution was written, there was a provision for amendments to be added to the Constitution. Amendments to the Constitution mean that there are additions to the Constitution that are law and actually become part of the Constitution. The first 10 amendments were approved in 1791 and actually were necessary for the adoption of the Constitution. Many people and many states felt that the Constitution indeed was a strong government document and would last for many, many years. However, the rights of the people were not in the Constitution until the first 10 amendments or additions. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution are called the Bill of Rights. Our freedom of speech, our freedom of religion, the basic freedoms that we enjoy in America are due to the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Now, through the years, other amendments have been added to the Constitution. Amendments such as Amendment 13, which ends slavery in America. The amendment that gives women the right to vote was an important addition to the Constitution. And other amendments which continue to give people their rights. So now in our study of American history and American government, we have gone over three basic lessons. Colonial America. We have touched briefly on the American Revolution. and we have touched on the government of the United States. And naturally, in the length of time that we've had to do this lesson, it is really not complete unless you do some reading. However, what I have told you in this lesson is enough for you to pass the U.S. Constitution exam, to get your naturalization papers, to become a citizen, and for those of you who need a basic review in American history, I'm sure that this video on home classroom video will be very helpful to you. Now, in conclusion, I would like to say that hopefully all of you have learned a great deal. America is a great country. Our traditions are from the 13 colonies, and new traditions are made every day. So I'd like to thank you for watching, and learn your American history, learn your American government, and you will be a much better citizen. And I thank you very much.